The sky over Charleston sagged heavy with dusk, purple and bruised, thunder grumbling on the horizon. The Rose Hill retirement home always seemed to breathe a little slower at this hour, its hallways muffled, gardens bathed in a sticky southern humidity that clung to the skin and made every breath feel borrowed from another time. In the back garden, somewhere between the wilting rose bushes and the moss-furred benches, Samantha Harper moved with the awkward energy of someone trying to convince herself she belonged. 27, sharp-witted but visibly new, she tried to keep her footsteps light as she walked Bear, the home's therapy dog and unofficial guardian, a massive German shepherd with mottled gray fur, haunted eyes, and a limp that dragged with each step. Bear walked ahead with a quiet authority, sniffing the warm, charged air. It was Samantha's third week on the job, and while she had quickly learned to trust Bear's instincts around the residents, he always seemed to know who needed a gentle nuzzle or a silent vigil at their feet. Tonight, the dog was different. He kept his ears pricked and his steps careful, every muscle bristling as if he could sense something none of the humans could. They rounded the corner toward the west wing, where the garden path narrowed, brushing the red brick walls beneath the flickering glow of security lights. Samantha hummed under her breath, the tune thin and off-key as she followed Bear toward the building. The dog's pace slowed abruptly as they reached the back entrance, just beneath the row of windows that belonged to the third floor. Bear's nose twitched, head turning to scan the dimly lit hallway beyond the glass. Inside, the hall was almost empty. The hum of the soda machine and the far-off voice of a nurse paging for extra linens provided a thin soundtrack. Bear led Samantha up the service stairs, past the lounge where the usual crowd of residents gathered for their evening bingo. She tried not to let the silence settle on her shoulders. On the third floor, Bear stopped cold outside room 316. His fur stood up in a rough ridge along his back, a low growl curling in his throat. Samantha's heart jumped. She'd walked these halls dozens of times with Bear, but she'd never seen him react this way. He moved with surprising speed, putting his massive body between her and the door. The locked door itself looked no different from any other. White paint chipped at the handle, a small paper sign hanging crookedly from a plastic holder. But Bear's claws scraped at the wood, a slow, deliberate scratching sound that echoed down the empty hallway. Samantha's hands trembled around the leash. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. Her gaze darted up and down the hallway, looking for someone else, anyone else. But there was only the relentless hum of the old light fixtures and the static charge of a storm waiting to break. Bear's growl deepened. Suddenly, Samantha saw it, a flicker of shadow passing low beneath the gap of the door. She blinked, her heart rattling in her chest. Was it a trick of the light, or was someone inside? At that moment, her supervisor, Mrs. Jennings, appeared at the far end of the corridor. She moved quickly for a woman her age, eyes sharp, lips pressed thin. "Samantha." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried all the weight of authority. She hurried over, her eyes flicking from Bear to the locked door. "Never open that door." The words were spat out, low and urgent, as if naming the danger would make it more real. Mrs. Jennings' gaze darted away, avoiding Samantha's searching eyes. Samantha's mind spun. She tried to press for more information, but Mrs. Jennings shook her head, her expression flat and implacable. "Let's keep moving, now." But Bear refused to budge, still growling, eyes glued to the door. Samantha hesitated, torn between following orders and listening to the unspoken plea in Bear's posture. A distant boom of thunder rattled the windows, and for a moment, The corridor was lit by a harsh, flickering white. In that split second, Samantha thought she saw another shadow cross behind the door, slow, deliberate, almost predatory. She swallowed, fear coiling tightly in her stomach. "Come on, Bear," she urged, but the German shepherd turned, nudged her hand with his broad nose. His eyes met hers, deep and dark, filled with something more than canine instinct, a kind of pleading, as if asking her to trust him over the voices of authority. Samantha felt a cold sweat at the base of her neck. Should she listen to the dog and investigate? Or should she follow orders, keep her head down, and hope the uneasy feeling faded away? In that suspended moment, the weight of every whisper, every sidelong glance from the staff, every locked door and unexplained sound in the night pressed down on her. Something was wrong here, deeply wrong, and Bear was the only one willing to call it out. With the leash trembling in her hand, Samantha crouched to Bear's level. "What do you want me to do, boy?" she murmured, voice barely audible above the storm outside. Bear licked her hand, then returned his gaze to the door, steadfast, resolute, unmoving. For the first time since she arrived at Rose Hill, Samantha realized she had a choice. Trust the uneasy calm of obedience, or the wild, wordless warning of a dog who had seen more than any human could. The air around her crackled with the promise of revelation, or disaster. Somewhere inside, something waited, and as Bear refused to leave, Samantha understood that turning away now would mean silencing her own instincts, just as everyone else had. The decision pressed down on her, urgent, electric, impossible to ignore. Night settled thickly over Rose Hill Retirement Home, swallowing the lingering glow of sunset and leaving the old building cloaked in restless quiet. Samantha Harper tossed and turned in her tiny staff room, her mind replaying the scene outside room 316. Bear's hackles up, that menacing growl, the flicker of something or someone inside. No matter how many times she blinked up at the pale ceiling, she couldn't shake the cold tension crawling beneath her skin. Outside her door, the hallway was a river of shadows. She heard the occasional shuffling step of a nurse on rounds, the clatter of a cart, the soft murmur of voices muffled behind closed doors. But mostly it was silence, the sort of silence that carried secrets like smoke in the air. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time Samantha closed her eyes, she saw Bear's eyes, insistent, worried, begging her to trust him. She wondered how many times Bear had tried to warn people before, how many times he'd gone ignored. Sighing, she rose, padded barefoot to the little window, and peered out at the garden below. A flash of lightning illuminated the wet grass, catching Bear's broad shape as he patrolled the fence line, ears pricked, unwavering in his devotion. When she returned to her bed, something caught her eye. A thin, pale slip of paper sticking out from under her door. She froze. Her heart leapt, both from fear and from the electric sense that she was no longer imagining things. Hands shaking, she knelt, retrieved the note, and unfolded it with care. The handwriting was hurried, slanted, almost panicked. "Stay away from the West Wing, for your own good." No signature. No explanation. Just the kind of warning that tightens the chest and turns the familiar into something sinister. Samantha's pulse hammered in her ears. Who would risk slipping her a note like this? Was it about room 316, or something worse? Thunder cracked overhead, and for a moment, she let herself sit on the edge of her bed, turning the note over and over in her fingers. The warning felt personal, intimate, as if someone out there knew she was close to discovering something she wasn't supposed to see. Morning brought little relief. Samantha pulled on her scrubs, forced a smile for her reflection, and made her way to the nurse's station. Bear was already waiting for her, tail sweeping the linoleum floor, eyes as alert as ever. But he wasn't relaxed. He was tense, his attention fixed once again on the hallway leading to room 316. Several times, as Samantha completed her rounds, Bear insisted on doubling back, his agitation growing with every trip past the forbidden door. "Come on, Bear," she whispered, trying to coax him away. But the dog wouldn't be swayed, planting himself firmly in front of 316, head bowed, a soft whine humming in his throat. Samantha felt the eyes of the other staff members on her, curious, suspicious, perhaps even a little afraid. She made a mental note to check the staff roster, to see if anyone stood out as the possible author of the note. As the day stretched on, Samantha's anxiety grew. She couldn't ignore the new feeling that something dark was moving beneath the surface of Rose Hill. During her break, she wandered the halls, checking patient records, making small talk, trying to piece together the connections that seemed to hum invisibly through the building. She noticed something odd: delivery records for medications that didn't appear on the official logs, always destined for the West Wing. Twice she passed a pair of orderlies whispering in hushed voices by the service elevator, their conversations stopping abruptly as she drew near. Late that afternoon, as she finished helping Mrs. Walker with her meal, Samantha heard it. The muffled sound of crying, faint and desperate, drifting from behind a closed door in the West Wing. She paused, spoon in midair. The sorrow in that voice was raw, unmistakable, a deep, racking sob that made her own eyes sting. Samantha glanced around. The hallway was empty. Driven by equal parts dread and compassion, she stepped closer, pressing her ear against the door. The crying continued for a few moments, then abruptly stopped, replaced by heavy silence. She straightened, nerves prickling, just as her supervisor, Mrs. Jennings, appeared around the corner, clipboard in hand. Samantha tried to hide her alarm, but Mrs. Jennings caught her look and narrowed her eyes. "You have questions, Miss Harper?" Her tone was chilly, her posture rigid. Samantha mustered her courage. Some things aren't adding up. Medications that don't get logged. Locked doors, people crying behind them." Mrs. Jennings' gaze went cold. "I'd suggest you focus on your assigned duties," she said, each word sharp as a slap. "The West Wing is off limits for a reason. We take privacy very seriously here." Then, in a low voice edged with threat, she added, "Curiosity can make a short career in places like this." Samantha's breath caught, fear warring with defiance. She wanted to protest, to demand answers, but Mrs. Jennings turned on her heel and stalked away, leaving her alone in the empty hallway. That night, as a storm battered the windows and the lights flickered, Samantha found herself unable to sleep. She slipped into her shoes and crept down to the lobby, only to find Bear waiting for her, lying outside the door to 316. The great dog's head rested on his paws, his eyes never leaving the door, his body a silent, unwavering guard. Samantha knelt beside him, feeling a wave of gratitude and fear crash together in her chest. Whatever secrets Rose Hill held, Bear would not let her face them alone. She stroked his fur, her decision hardening with every pass of her hand. She would not ignore the warnings. She would trust Bear and her own instincts. Whatever darkness lived behind that door, she would find the truth. Even if it meant risking everything. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and old linoleum, sunlight slicing weakly through the blinds as Samantha moved down the morning hallway. The entire world seemed to have contracted to the length of her own shadow, narrow, uncertain, barely touching the edges of the nurse's station. After another night spent staring at the ceiling, clutching the warning note in one fist. She felt a mix of exhaustion and clarity that sharpened her senses. She'd started to see the retirement home as it truly was, not a place of peace, but of secrets carefully tended, like weeds growing beneath the roses outside. Bear was waiting for her, tail thumping softly, his massive head lifting in greeting. Samantha ruffled his ears, whispering, "I'm not giving up," as much for her own reassurance as his. She studied the staff as they filed in and out for the morning shift. The orderlies with their guarded eyes, the harried kitchen workers, the nurses too busy for conversation. Her gaze lingered on the locked door to 316 at the end of the corridor. The memory of Bear's growl and that shadowed flicker haunting her. Samantha busied herself with routine, dispensing medications, adjusting pillows, exchanging quiet words with patients. Still, her mind wandered. Why was Bear so drawn to 316? Why the threat in Mrs. Jennings' voice? And who was desperate enough to slip her a note? She scanned the room for clues as she worked, trying to see the home with fresh eyes. It was Bear who drew her attention again, this time with a soft huff and a nudge of his nose. He led her away from the bustle, toward the nurse's station, pausing at a spot where the tile floor creaked beneath her feet. Samantha looked down. There was a small crack in one of the tiles, just at the corner of the counter, a detail she'd never noticed before. Bear scratched at it, looking up at her expectantly. Heart pounding, Samantha crouched and ran her fingers along the edge. The tile was loose. Glancing around to be sure no one was watching, she carefully pried it up, revealing a warped floorboard underneath. She worked her fingers beneath the board, pried it up with a soft groan, and found a shallow, dust-choked cavity. Inside lay a small, battered plastic toy, a green army man with chipped paint, clutching a rifle. Next to it, a tarnished brass key tied with a faded piece of blue string. Samantha lifted them out, her breath catching when she saw tiny initials carved into the toy's base. GHB. She turned the key over in her palm, reading the number engraved there, 316. The corridor was empty, the quiet humming with the promise of discovery. Bear sat beside her, tail wagging just enough to betray his excitement. Samantha's hands trembled. The initials matched a name she'd seen on an old yellowed staff list during orientation. Gerald H. Brooks, a resident who was said to have passed away years before she'd started. Why would a child's toy and a key to room 316 be hidden here, just steps from the nurse's station? Samantha sat on the floor, back pressed to the wall, her thoughts spinning. The world felt suddenly off-kilter, as if a piece of reality had shifted, and something monstrous now hovered at the edge of perception. She thought of the hollow sadness she'd sensed in the West Wing, the shadow in 316, Bear's refusal to leave that door. She remembered every moment of self-doubt since starting this job, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room, the feeling that she was being watched, the way her questions were met with tight-lipped silence. Bear pressed his nose into her lap, and she scratched behind his ears, taking comfort in his steady presence. "You knew this was here, didn't you?" she whispered. The dog simply wagged his tail, his gaze fixed on her with unwavering loyalty. She slipped the key and toy into her pocket, glancing down the corridor to make sure no one had seen her discovery. The nurse's station, usually a place of comfort and order, now seemed like a stage for a play she hadn't known she was part of. For a moment, she felt utterly invisible, a ghost among the living, powerless to change the script. A memory surfaced. Herself as a child, hiding beneath the kitchen table while her parents argued in low, tired voices. She remembered the feeling of wishing she could make herself smaller, quieter, less in the way. That old ache, the ache of invisibility, welled up again, but now it was tinged with something new. Was she still powerless? Or had Bear shown her a different kind of strength? The fact that he trusted her, that he'd led her here, made her feel braver than she ever had before. Shoving down her fear, Samantha rose and returned to the staff lounge. She logged into the staff directory, scrolling through the digital records until she found it. Gerald H. Brooks, date of birth 1946. Date of death listed as 2018. A line of text at the bottom. Personal effects transferred to next of kin. But there was no next of kin listed. She dug deeper, finding an old incident report, one that referenced a security concern in the West Wing, dated just days before Gerald's supposed passing. The file had been locked, flagged for administrator access only. She closed the screen as footsteps approached. Bear nudged her knee again, as if to say, "You're not alone." Samantha looked at the key in her hand, feeling the metal warm in her palm. Bear had shown her the path, but now the next step was hers alone. Resolve hardened inside her. She couldn't ignore what she'd found. Whatever the truth about Gerald H. Brooks and room 316, she owed it to herself and to Bear to find out. The memory of her own struggles with self-doubt flickered, but Bear's trust had awakened something fierce inside her. That afternoon, as the sun slanted gold across the worn linoleum, Samantha stood alone in the corridor, the key to 316 clutched tightly in her hand. Bear pressed close, silent and alert. The echo of his claws on the tile was her only company as she approached the forbidden door. For the first time, Samantha felt her fear transforming, becoming courage, not because she was fearless, but because she could not turn away from the truth any longer. Whatever waited on the other side, she would face it. She owed that much to Bear, to Gerald, and to herself. With a deep breath, she slipped the key into her pocket, promising Bear and herself that she would return, stronger and ready to face whatever secrets Rose Hill had tried to bury. Samantha stood at the threshold of room 316, the tarnished key in her hand sweating cold against her palm. Bear hovered at her side, not making a sound, only watching her with a focus that bordered on human intensity. The corridor was empty. The only noise was the thud of her heart and the distant clatter of a medicine cart somewhere far down the hall. Thunder rumbled again outside, rattling the old window panes, as if warning her to turn back. But the time for turning back had passed. She checked the hall one last time. Nobody. She slid the key into the lock. The sound was deafening in the hush. A mechanical click, a groan as the door swung inward on tired hinges. The air that spilled out was stale, tinged with the scent of dust and something sweet, almost medicinal. The room was dim, the curtains half drawn against the coming storm, their patterns faded by years of sunlight. For a moment, Samantha hesitated in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust, letting Bear step in first. He moved ahead slowly, body low, tail stiff, sniffing at the edge of the bed, and then the far corner by the window. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. For a space that had been locked and ignored for so long, the room was hauntingly lived in. A battered wheelchair, old notebooks stacked on the nightstand, a cracked ceramic mug left by the bed, half filled with water gone cloudy. And there, sitting in the wheelchair, gaunt and almost spectral in the dimness, was Gerald. She knew it was him, even before she saw the pale hospital bracelet on his wrist and the initials GHB. Sharp features had been carved thinner by time and neglect. His eyes, deep-set and rimmed with fatigue, turned toward her with a mix of suspicion and something softer, hope maybe, or just the shock of seeing another soul. Gerald clutched a notebook to his chest, fingers trembling, knuckles white. His gaze flicked from Samantha to Bear and back again, as if measuring the threat or the possibility of salvation. Bear moved to Gerald's side, sitting down as if they'd always belonged together. The room was silent except for the whisper of the storm and the soft, shuddering breaths of the old man. Samantha's voice, when it came, was little more than a hush. "Mr. Brooks?" Gerald didn't answer right away. He seemed to study Bear's face, searching for something. At last, in a voice thin as old paper, he spoke. "You're not supposed to be here. Nobody's supposed to know." Samantha took a tentative step forward. Her nerves thrummed, but she pressed on. "I'm Samantha. I found your key. And the toy soldier. I want to help." The old man's fingers clenched tighter around his notebook. "Help." He gave a broken, almost laughless sound. "They said help would come. But it never does. Not really." Bear leaned against Gerald's leg, and a shiver ran through the old man. For a heartbeat, Samantha saw herself reflected in him, fragile, cornered, but not entirely without hope. She remembered her own nights spent trapped by fear, fear of failing, fear of being invisible, fear that nobody would ever truly see her. She wondered how long Gerald had waited in this room, hidden from the world. Samantha's own hands shook as she crouched beside the wheelchair, the storm outside throwing flashes of white across the peeling wallpaper. "I'm listening," she whispered. "Please, let me help." Gerald swallowed hard, his lips twitching with words he seemed almost too afraid to say. "They keep us here," he managed. "They write us off. Nobody asks questions. It's easier that way." Bear watched him steadily, ears twitching at each rumble of thunder, offering a calm she desperately needed. Gerald lifted his trembling hand, offering her the notebook. Samantha took it gently, flipping through page after page of frantic notes. Scribbled words, names, numbers, and desperate scrawls. Phrases jumped out at her. "Project Echo. They were supposed to be dead. Don't trust the white coats." A chill traced her spine. She recognized the pattern. This was more than confusion or dementia. These were notes made in terror, in desperate clarity. Evidence. She looked up at Gerald, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened to you?" He glanced at the door, lowering his voice. "They used to come at night. The tests, the questions. Some of us didn't come back. I saw things I shouldn't have. That's why they hid me. They thought if nobody saw me, if I just disappeared, the secret would die too." Bear's head lifted, as if he understood every word. Gerald's next words came as a plea. "She's not the only one. There's another. You have to find June." His hand shook as he tore a small slip of paper from the back of his notebook, pressing it into Samantha's palm. "It's coded. Only someone desperate enough will try to crack it. Promise me, don't trust anyone in a white coat." Samantha nodded, tucking the coded message into her pocket. The old man's warning rang in her ears. Outside, rain lashed the windows, the storm intensifying. She felt the walls closing in, a cage disguised as comfort. As she backed toward the door, Bear still by Gerald's side, Gerald whispered, "They'll come looking. If you stay, you'll vanish too." His eyes, suddenly bright with tears, locked on hers. "But if you run, don't look back. Not until you find June." Samantha hesitated, torn between wanting to stay and the raw urgency in Gerald's words. She pressed her hand over his, promising, "I'll find her, I swear." She let Bear lead her out. The door clicked shut behind her, erasing all trace of their meeting. But the fear, the urgency, the sense of a secret world turning beneath the surface, those things she carried with her, heavier than any physical burden. Back in the hallway, the storm raged. But inside Samantha, something had changed. The terror and doubt still buzzed in her veins. But now there was resolve, too. She had seen the truth hidden behind the locked door, and she would not turn away. Not this time. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the coded slip through her uniform. Bear's warm body pressed to her leg. Together, they stepped out into the gathering storm, knowing they were now in the eye of something far bigger and far darker than she had ever imagined. The wind screamed outside, sending sheets of rain against the windows as night swallowed Rose Hill in a blackness that seemed almost sentient. Samantha's pulse was a frantic drumbeat as she sat at the edge of her bed, the slip of coded paper clutched in one hand, Gerald's notebook open in the other. Bear, ever faithful, lay pressed against her shins, tail thumping softly as if to remind her she wasn't alone. Every creak of the building, every shifting shadow, seemed to carry a warning. Stay away, stay safe. But Samantha was done listening to fear. She'd spent hours decoding Gerald's warning, studying the way his hand shook as he'd written, the desperation in his careful instructions. Find June. She'd promised, and she meant to keep it. Her mind replayed the old man's words, the terror in his eyes, the heartbreak in his plea. There was another, and time was running out. The clock on her nightstand read 2:13 a.m. The world outside had grown silent, the storm's rage now muffled as it moved out over the harbor. The home's night staff had retreated to their posts, most dozing, some reading by the glow of their phones. The halls were empty, the perfect time to slip unnoticed into the West Wing. She dressed in black, heart hammering with every zip and snap. Bear sat at the door, already alert, eyes fixed on her as if reading her intentions. Samantha crouched and pressed her forehead to his. "Ready, partner?" she whispered, voice barely audible. Bear gave a soft chuff, tail wagging in solidarity. Together they crept through the winding corridors, the light from Samantha's small pen flashlight casting pale circles that seemed to dart and shiver along the walls. They passed the nurse's station, where a security monitor flickered with feeds from sleepy cameras. Samantha's stomach clenched. One wrong move and she'd lose everything. But Bear seemed to sense her nerves and pressed closer, his presence steady and grounding. As they approached the West Wing, the air grew colder. Samantha noticed the tiny details she'd overlooked before. Security pads on the doors, a faint, acrid tang in the air, a silence that felt too heavy to be natural. She pressed her back to the wall and waited, counting the seconds as a staff member wandered past, humming tunelessly, keys jangling at his hip. When the coast was clear, she moved forward, Bear at her heel, both careful not to make a sound. The forbidden door to the West Wing loomed before her, a thick slab of metal with a blinking keypad and a security camera in the corner. Samantha's hands shook as she retrieved Gerald's notebook. She flipped to a page where a faint, oily thumbprint stood out against the margin, right next to a series of numbers. "Fingerprints," Gerald had muttered. "They won't check the dead." She'd seen the same oily print repeated several times on the notebook's edges, and now she understood. It was the clue she needed. Pulling a scrap of clear tape from her pocket, she pressed it gently against the fingerprint, lifting the oil with a delicacy that surprised even her. She placed it on the biometric scanner, holding her breath as the device blinked. then turned green. The lock clicked open. Samantha's knees nearly buckled from relief. Bear nudged her, pushing her forward. The corridor beyond was colder still, painted in a sterile white that gleamed in the faint emergency lighting. The air was thick with the scent of bleach and something metallic. Samantha moved quickly, Bear at her side, her senses stretched to the limit. She passed empty rooms, their doors ajar to reveal stripped beds and broken wheelchairs, the remnants of a world that had been hidden from view. At the end of the hall, she found what she was looking for. Room 317. The door was sealed, a heavy biometric lock glowing red. Samantha pressed the same tape to the scanner. There was a tense pause, then another click. The door inched open. Inside, the room was dim, shadows curling around a single bed where a woman lay strapped down, wrists and ankles bound, face gaunt and pale beneath stringy hair. Samantha's breath caught. She looked barely conscious, her lips moving in a slow, silent plea. A wristband circled her fragile wrist. Subject 13, June. Samantha rushed to her side, hands fumbling with the restraints. "June, can you hear me?" she whispered urgently. The woman's eyes fluttered, tears streaking her hollow cheeks. "Help! Please!" The words came out cracked, raw with suffering. Bear pressed close, growling low as he scented something. A warning. Samantha froze, listening. In the hallway, footsteps pounded. Voices rose in alarm. Somewhere an alarm shrieked, a high, metallic wail that sent adrenaline flooding her veins. She worked desperately at the buckles, finally loosening the restraints. "June, I'm here to help you. You have to trust me." June's fingers clung to Samantha's wrist with surprising strength, desperation clear in her gaze. Bear barked, the deep, echoing sound a challenge and a distraction. The voices in the hall swelled. Samantha knew she had seconds. She leaned in, voice urgent. "I'll come back for you, I promise." June's eyes widened, and she gave a tiny nod, as if understanding the gravity of the promise. The door rattled. Someone was trying to force it open. Bear barked again, louder, his body blocking the threshold as Samantha slipped through the emergency exit at the back of the room. She cast one last look at June, then disappeared into the darkness. Bear at her side, the alarm still shrieking behind them. They bolted down the staff stairs, breath coming in panicked bursts. Every corner could hide a threat. Every shadow could conceal someone who would make her vanish, like Gerald said. But Bear stayed at her side, a sentinel, guiding her as she ducked through storage rooms and utility corridors until they finally emerged into the cool, storm-washed night. As they stumbled into the shadows beneath the eaves, Samantha held tight to Bear's fur, the weight of her promise burning inside her. She looked up at the storm-torn sky, the first true spark of defiance glowing in her chest. She'd found June. She'd exposed the secret. And now there was no going back. Inside, alarms still screamed, but out here Samantha felt a new sense of resolve. Bear looked up at her, eyes bright. She nodded, breathless. "We're not done yet, boy. Not by a long shot." They vanished into the storm, hope clinging to them like a second skin, knowing they'd risked everything, but knowing too that sometimes the only way to save someone is to break every rule that's ever tried to keep you silent. Samantha's hands trembled as she closed the door to her room, the coded message from Gerald pressed between her fingers. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Bear circled her feet, his nails tapping the tile as he watched her every move. She flicked on her desk lamp, spreading Gerald's notebook and the slip of paper across the small table. "Okay, buddy," she whispered, rubbing Bear's ears. Let's see what we're really up against. She scanned the strange symbols and numbers, recognizing some of them as abbreviations for names, rooms, and, oddly enough, medical procedures she'd only ever glimpsed in passing on supply forms. Beneath the codes, Gerald had written 3 words in shaky block letters: "Look under garden." She sucked in a breath. Was it literal? Or another clue layered in riddles? A quick knock at her window made her jump. She spun, heart pounding, and was relieved to see a familiar face outside, Caleb Jennings, her old friend who now worked compliance at the hospital. He held up his ID badge and a flashlight. "It's me," he mouthed. "Let me in." She unlatched the window, helping him climb in, Bear wagging his tail and sniffing at his pockets. Caleb looked rumpled, tired, his eyes darting nervously. "You said it was urgent." "More than urgent," Samantha said, pushing the papers toward him. "I need help, Caleb. And you can't tell anyone, not even your dad." His jaw tightened. His father was head of facilities and a stickler for rules. But he nodded. "I'm here." As they pored over the coded message, Samantha explained everything. Gerald hidden away, the West Wing secrets, June's cry for help, and the warning to trust no one. Caleb shook his head, disbelief melting into concern. "This is big, Sam. If what you're saying is true, it goes way beyond elder care violations." She gave a dry laugh. "I know. That's why I need someone who knows how to dig." Caleb's contacts included Maddox, a freelance investigator with a checkered past, but an undeniable knack for finding buried truths. With a quick, nervous text, Caleb arranged a midnight meeting. Maddox arrived 30 minutes later, all rumpled jacket and sly grin, eyes scanning the room for threats before settling on Samantha and Bear. "I like dogs," he said. "They're the only honest things in places like this." Samantha handed over Gerald's code, watching Maddox's practiced eyes dance over the page. "You got blueprints?" he asked, voice low. Caleb dug into his backpack, pulling out old facility maps borrowed from the archives. Maddox compared the coded message to the plans, tracing lines with his finger. "There," he said at last, jabbing the page. "A crawl space beneath the original garden, sealed off in the 90s. Says here, staff access only. But if you're hiding something illegal, it's perfect. No cameras, no prying eyes." Samantha's skin prickled. She looked at Bear, who whined softly, sensing her unease. "Gerald said Project Echo. What is that?" Maddox's jaw worked as he thought. Echo was a neural experiment, rumors mostly. Military contracts, black budget stuff. Supposedly it was shut down decades ago after... He trailed off, eyes flickering. "After some people died. Dr. Ellis Quaid ran the last project anyone knows about. The name still makes folks nervous." Caleb found an old memo in the files. Dr. Quaid listed as lead consultant, with numerous entries for experimental cognitive rehabilitation, subject transfer, and cryptic notations like Subject 13, watch for escalation. The deeper they looked, the clearer the horror became. Rose Hill was a front, a place to hide those deemed disposable by shadowy research interests. June, Subject 13, was next in line for transfer, a word that now sounded like a death sentence. The clock ticked past 3 a.m. Samantha's eyelids burned, but she pressed on, adrenaline driving her. "If June's still here, we have to get her out. Tonight." Bear shifted, sensing her tension, and nuzzled her hand. For a second, Samantha hesitated. She'd always handled things alone, never trusted anyone with her deepest fears. Asking Caleb and Maddox for help felt like exposing a wound, inviting disaster. What if one of them betrayed her? What if she was risking more lives by letting them in? Caleb must have read her thoughts. Sam, you can't do this alone. Trust me. We've got your back. Bear licked her knuckles, and something inside Samantha softened. She looked at her allies, one lifelong friend, one unlikely stranger, and one steadfast dog. Maybe trust was the only way forward. Maddox pulled a burner phone from his pocket, passing it to Samantha. Use this if things go sideways. I'll dig up anything I can on Quaid's associates and the scheduled transfer. His tone grew sober. Don't trust anyone in a lab coat, not even the night staff. With a trembling hand, Samantha texted the mysterious number on the transfer order, posing as an administrator. The reply came quick. Transfer at 5 a.m., be ready. They had less than 2 hours. She looked at Bear, at the coded maps, at the faces of her new allies. For the first time, she saw hope on the horizon, shining through the fear. We'll save her, she promised, voice fierce and clear. And we'll make sure no one ever uses this place for evil again. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window. Inside, Samantha let herself believe, for a moment, that the tide was turning. With Bear at her side, and her friends behind her, she was ready to fight for the truth, whatever it cost. In the pale light before dawn, their plan took shape. Tonight, the silence of Rose Hill would be shattered, not by secrets, but by courage. And if justice meant exposing every cover-up and every hidden room, Samantha was ready to drag the darkness into the light. The clock on Samantha's phone glowed 3:08 a.m. The corridors of Rose Hill were quieter than a grave, shadows pooling in corners, silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights. Samantha's heart pounded, her entire body tense and alert. Beside her, Bear stood as still as a statue, ears pricked, nose twitching at every shift in the air. Every instinct told her to turn back, to hide, to pretend none of this was happening. But then she thought of Gerald's trembling hand, June's desperate eyes, and the promise she'd made to both. She couldn't run, not now. Caleb had sent a short, nervous text just after midnight. Tonight. Maddox has the plans. It's now or never. Samantha had barely slept. She'd gone over the escape route with Caleb and Maddox again and again. Out of habit or maybe fear, she wasn't sure. She replayed every step in her mind. Disable the security cameras in the West Wing. Slip down the service corridor. Avoid the nurses on rounds. And make it to June's room without being seen. Gerald would create a distraction in the East Lounge, giving Samantha and Bear the precious minutes they needed to act. Now, standing in the half-light near the nurses' station, Samantha felt sweat trickle down her back. She glanced at Bear. "You ready?" she whispered. The dog's tail gave a single sweep in reply. All business, his old K9 instincts coming alive for a new kind of rescue. She slipped through the double doors to the West Wing, Bear at her heel, both moving silently on the worn linoleum. At the junction near the stairwell, Maddox's voice came through her earpiece, low and steady. "All clear. Security's in the break room. 10 minutes tops." Samantha nodded to herself, counting her breaths. She passed the first checkpoint, an old fire door wedged open with a brick, just as Maddox had promised. Next, she ducked into the laundry alcove, heart stuttering as footsteps echoed nearby. Bear pressed close, silent, sensing her anxiety. The footsteps faded. A nurse on her way to the medication room, oblivious to the drama swirling just out of sight. Then the alarms blared. Samantha's heart lurched. For a split second, she panicked. Had they been caught? But through the earpiece, Gerald's voice crackled. "It's me. I pulled the plug. Go now!" His voice was weak, but the determination in it made Samantha's eyes sting. She darted down the hall, Bear leading the way, nose to the ground. The biometric locked door to room 317 loomed ahead. Samantha pulled the lifted fingerprint, pressed it to the scanner, please work, and felt relief flood her when the door clicked open. Inside, the room was dim, heavy with antiseptic and sorrow. June was strapped to the bed, eyes wide and terrified. Her arms were bruised, wrists raw from the restraints. A monitor beeped in the corner, but otherwise the world seemed to hold its breath. Samantha rushed to her side, hands shaking as she fumbled with the straps. June, I'm here. I'm getting you out. Bear jumped onto the bed, licking June's hand. She let out a broken laugh, tears springing to her eyes. The last strap came free. June tried to sit, her legs wobbling. Can you walk? Samantha whispered. June nodded, though her face was tight with pain and effort. Bear braced himself against her side, supporting her with quiet strength. Footsteps thundered down the corridor, security called by the alarm. Maddox's voice was urgent in her ear. They're moving faster than we thought. Back door now. Gerald's on the move. Don't wait. Samantha guided June toward the hall, Bear acting as both shield and anchor. They slipped out just as two orderlies rushed into the room behind them. There! Stop! Bear turned, barking ferociously, his deep voice echoing down the sterile hallway. The orderlies hesitated, startled, giving Samantha the opening she needed. She dragged June around the corner, through the emergency exit. Maddox was waiting at the far end of the corridor, waving frantically. This way, he hissed, ushering them through a maintenance room cluttered with old mops and rusted tools. Bear knocked over a mop bucket, sending it clattering behind them, a noisy diversion that drew shouts from the orderlies and security guards now flooding the west wing. Samantha felt her lungs burning as she hurried after Maddox, June leaning on her for every step. Almost there, she whispered, more to herself than to June. Bear led them down a darkened flight of stairs to the basement level, where the old service tunnels ran beneath Rose Hill. Gerald had described the route in detail. Follow the red pipe, take the first left, listen for the sound of dripping water. They plunged into the darkness, Bear's shape a steady shadow ahead of them. The tunnel was cramped, lined with cobwebs and the stink of mold. June coughed, fighting for breath. Maddox kept glancing back, urging them forward. Faster! They're on our tail! At the final bend, Samantha heard it, the clamor of pursuit, voices echoing off concrete. She urged June on, adrenaline driving away her fear. Bear squeezed through a broken vent ahead, barking once to signal the exit. Gerald was waiting at the far side, clutching a flashlight and looking exhausted, but triumphant. Hurry! He called, voice cracking. Maddox helped June through the gap, then Samantha. Bear was last, twisting to make sure no one followed. They stumbled into the night, a muddy drainage ditch spitting them out into the wet grass behind the home. The storm had cleared, leaving the air heavy and clean. For the first time in weeks, Samantha tasted hope on the breeze. She looked at her ragtag group. June weak but alive. Gerald braver than anyone had realized. Maddox already scanning the shadows for danger, and Bear, his fur slick and eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Tears mingled with laughter as they embraced, hearts racing. Samantha hugged Bear fiercely. You did it, boy, she whispered, voice breaking. Behind them, the chaos inside Rose Hill grew louder, but it couldn't touch them now. They were free, for the moment. And as Bear stood watch, moonlight glinting off his badge, Samantha knew their fight wasn't over. But they had escaped the nightmare. For tonight. And together, they would face whatever came next. The first rays of dawn crept over Charleston, painting the sky a bruised lavender as Samantha, Bear, June, Gerald, and Maddox huddled inside the cramped, musty safe house Maddox had prepared weeks earlier, just in case. The air smelled of old carpet and mildew, every sound outside making Samantha flinch. She'd never felt so exposed, yet so alive. For the first time in weeks, June was unshackled, breathing free air, her thin frame wrapped in a borrowed blanket. Gerald sat by the window, keeping watch, while Bear curled protectively at June's feet, his eyes never closing. The adrenaline from their escape had faded, leaving behind a raw exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. Samantha's hands shook as she opened the battered duffel Maddox had carried. Inside were files, a battered laptop, and a cheap prepaid phone. Maddox plugged in a flash drive. "This is everything I could get off the Rose Hill servers before we blew out. Staff logs, patient records, emails, enough to make the state scream if we get it to the right people." Caleb, who'd stayed behind to keep up appearances at the hospital, texted from a burner. "They're searching for you. Security knows you're with June and Gerald. Don't come back." Samantha's chest tightened. "We're running out of time," she said. "How do we prove what's happening before they find us?" Maddox grimaced. "We need to find the smoking gun. The files will help, but someone has to speak, someone who lived it." His gaze landed on June. The woman looked up, eyes haunted, but with a flicker of resolve. "If you tell your story," Samantha said softly, "it could save lives." June's voice was barely a whisper. "Will they believe me?" Bear nuzzled her knee, as if giving his own silent answer. Samantha squeezed June's hand. "I do, and you're not alone anymore." The hours blurred together as they combed through the files. Samantha found report after report of subject transfers, medication orders that didn't match patient charts, and internal emails from Dr. Ellis Quaid's private account. Some messages hinted at a network of similar facilities, all funneling data to shadowy research groups. Most chilling were the redacted photos of experimental sessions. Gerald's trembling hands hovered over those, as if touching old ghosts. As the day wore on, the dangers multiplied. Maddox left to scout the neighborhood, returning breathless and angry. "Someone slashed our tires. Your car's trunk was popped, Sam. Nothing taken, but it's a warning. We need to move again soon." June flinched at every sound. Gerald muttered to himself, rocking back and forth, but every so often he'd meet Bear's steady gaze and calm a little. Samantha realized that Bear was more than a comfort. He was the thread holding them together, the anchor in their storm. By mid-afternoon, Samantha pieced together the clearest story yet. "Look at this," she said, showing Maddox an encrypted document she'd managed to unlock. "These are trial notes. Subject 13, June, scheduled for neurological reset on the same day as the supposed transfer. They're wiping memories, using these people as test cases for a drug that never got FDA approval. Dr. Quaid is signing off on all of it." Maddox whistled. "That's enough to get the media on our side. But we need June to testify, and we need to leak this before they bury the evidence." Bear whined and pawed at the door. Samantha peered through the curtains and caught sight of a black SUV idling at the corner. "Quaid's people," Maddox said. "We have to go." They packed what they could, moving quickly and quietly. Samantha hugged June. "Can you do this?" she asked gently. June nodded, strength flickering in her eyes. "If I can help stop them, I want to try." The escape from the safe house was tense. Gerald and Maddox led June through a back alley, while Samantha and Bear doubled back, creating a false trail. At every turn, they felt eyes watching. Twice a car slowed near them, and Bear's deep growl sent it hurrying away. The group reunited at a battered motel by the river, where Caleb met them with keys, snacks, and news. "They've issued a bolo. Be on the lookout," Caleb whispered, face pale. "But I sent the files to a reporter at the Post and Courier. She's agreed to meet us tonight, and the state attorney's office is scheduling a hearing. June, they want you to testify if you're strong enough." June's hands shook as she signed the statement, but her voice grew steadier with each word. "I remember what they did, and I remember the faces of the ones who never made it out." Bear rested his head on her lap, as if willing her to continue. That night, the safe house felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. They watched the news on a flickering motel TV. Rose Hill's name flashed across the ticker, investigation into patient abuse and illegal experimentation underway. Caleb's leak had worked, but their safety was fragile. Just after midnight, someone rattled the doorknob, sending Bear into a barking frenzy. Maddox peered through the peephole, just a drunk stumbling past for now. But the threat lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. As the moon rose, June finally managed to sleep. Bear curled up beside her. Samantha sat with Gerald and Maddox at the tiny table, exhaustion painting every face. "We did it," Gerald whispered, almost in disbelief. "We got out." "Not all the way," Maddox cautioned. "But we're closer." Samantha gazed at Bear, feeling a surge of gratitude and pride. She'd never believed a dog could change her life. Now she knew Bear had changed many. He'd given them hope when it felt impossible. The following morning would bring the hearing, media attention, and maybe justice. But for tonight, Samantha allowed herself to believe that they'd finally cracked the darkness at the heart of Rose Hill. And whatever else lay ahead, they'd face it together. For the first time since this nightmare began, hope felt real. The courthouse steps were slick with last night's rain, but already, by mid-morning, a crowd pressed close to the entrance. Reporters huddled in clumps, microphones poised, faces taut with anticipation. News vans lined the curb, cameras swiveling at every movement. For Samantha, the world felt both impossibly huge and razor-sharp. Every sight, sound, and sensation cut into her nerves. Bear walked at her side, his service vest newly brushed, tags gleaming. He moved with a calm certainty, unbothered by the crowd. And every so often, Samantha would rest her hand on his broad head, feeling his silent reassurance. June clung to her other arm, still fragile, but standing on her own. Gerald followed, supported by Maddox and Caleb, his eyes scanning the faces with a mix of anxiety and wonder. For years, Gerald had been a ghost. Now, the world was watching him step into the light. Inside the courthouse, the tension was almost physical. The hearing room buzzed as people took their seats. Survivors, family members, hospital staff, and a scattering of public officials. At the far end of the room sat Dr. Ellis Quaid, immaculate in a gray suit, his expression unreadable, eyes darting from person to person like a man calculating every risk. His legal team whispered furiously, stacking folders and thumbing through notes, but the shadow of exposed secrets clung to them. Samantha squeezed June's hand. "We're here," she whispered. "You're safe. Whatever happens next, they can't erase what you've survived." June nodded, lips trembling but resolved. Bear sat on her feet, drawing stares and soft smiles from those around them. In a way, his presence reminded everyone that there was something pure and uncorrupted in this mess, a kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought or bullied. The panel of investigators filed in, stern-faced, voices low as they reviewed the evidence. When the hearing was called to order, Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She'd rehearsed what she would say 1,000 times, but standing there, every doubt she'd ever known threatened to swallow her. The first questions were procedural. Where had she worked? What had she witnessed? Who had helped her? Samantha's voice shook at first, but Bear nudged her knee and her resolve deepened. She spoke about the warnings, the secrecy, the locked doors, and the threats. She recounted finding Gerald in isolation, June's condition, the coded message, the missing medication logs, the night of their escape. Each answer built on the last, her own journey from invisibility to courage unfolding in front of the room. "I was scared," she admitted, voice clear. "But Bear never let me give up. Every time I doubted myself, he reminded me that doing what's right is rarely easy, but it's always necessary." June was next. Her testimony was raw, halting but honest. She described the days locked in room 317, the treatments administered by white-coated doctors, the terror of being told she was being transferred, never to see her friends again. Tears slid down her cheeks as she spoke the names of others who hadn't survived. Gerald's voice broke when he described his own years of isolation, the fear and guilt that had kept him silent until Bear and Samantha broke through his walls. Across the aisle, Dr. Quaid shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the table. When questioned, he tried to spin the facts. Experimental therapy, outdated reporting, necessary for the advancement of science. But the evidence was overwhelming. Internal emails, secret files, and survivor testimony created a tapestry of cruelty and deception that could not be unraveled. At one point, a panel member asked Samantha, "Why did you keep going? Why not just leave and protect yourself?" She looked at Bear. Her answer simple. "Because no one else would have. And because Bear believed in me, even when I didn't." The hearing stretched on for hours. When it was finally over, the panel deliberated, then delivered their verdict. A full criminal investigation, immediate suspension of all staff connected to Project Echo, and a promise to support the survivors and their families. Relief washed over Samantha, but it was tinged with sorrow for those who hadn't made it to this day. As the hearing room emptied, family members wept and hugged, reporters crowded around, hungry for quotes. Caleb and Maddox clapped Gerald on the back, while June slumped in her chair, exhaustion and hope warring in her face. Samantha sat quietly, Bear's head in her lap. She thought about everything they'd lost, innocence, years, sometimes even faith in other people. But something else remained, the knowledge that change was possible, but only if people refused to look away. Institutions became corrupt not because of a few bad people, but because so many good people remained silent. She looked around the room and saw the true scope of the victory. Survivors finding each other, families reunited, voices finally heard. She realized courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about standing up, shaking, and speaking anyway. And she owed that courage in part to Bear. As she rose to leave, Samantha saw Dr. Quaid being led away in handcuffs. The cameras flashed, the world recording every second. In the crowd, June found her, hugging her fiercely. "You didn't just save me," June whispered. "You gave us all back our names." Bear barked, tail thumping, and the room seemed to breathe again. Justice was only the beginning. The road to healing would be long. But for the first time, Samantha believed they would walk it together, heads high, hearts open, and never, ever silent again. The headlines spread across Charleston like wildfire. Whistleblower nurse and hero dog expose hidden atrocities at Rose Hill. The story ricocheted from newsrooms to kitchen tables, sparking outrage and sympathy in equal measure. In every article and TV segment, Samantha's face appeared alongside Bear's. a symbol of courage, resilience, and the power of a single act to change many lives. Within days, Rose Hill was shuttered by court order. Yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, sealing off the building that for so long had hidden so much suffering. Former residents were relocated to better homes, families reunited, records reviewed. The government announced new oversight committees, and other facilities scrambled to inspect their own practices. No one could pretend any longer that these places were above scrutiny. But even as the legal gears churned, for Samantha, June, Gerald, and the rest, the path to healing was deeply personal. On the first bright afternoon after the hearing, Samantha returned to Rose Hill's old garden, now overgrown, but still touched by sunlight and birdsong. Survivors and their families gathered there, some in wheelchairs, others walking slowly with canes and determined steps. Laughter and tears mingled as old friends found each other, sharing memories of both the pain and the small moments of kindness that had kept them alive. Samantha stood with Bear at her side, the faithful German shepherd's coat freshly brushed for the occasion. His limp was a little worse, too many years of service and not enough rest. But his eyes were bright, tail thumping as children came to pet him. He wore a shiny new medal on his collar, the city's highest award for animal bravery. Reporters snapped photos as Bear basked in the attention, his story capturing hearts everywhere. At the center of the gathering, June took Samantha's hands in her own. Her recovery had been slow, but every day she gained strength. "You saved my life," June whispered, her voice trembling. "But you also gave me back my name. No more Subject 13. Tears shone in her eyes as she glanced around at the small crowd. Survivors, their families, and a handful of staff who'd risked their careers to do what was right. "You showed us all that we matter." Gerald joined them, standing a little taller than before, pride flickering in his tired eyes. "The world only changes," he said, "when someone refuses to let it stay the same." He pressed a handwritten letter into Samantha's palm, a thank you, a confession, and a prayer that the light they'd shined would never go out. The ceremony was simple but powerful. Bear received his medal. Samantha was honored as a whistleblower and hero, though she accepted the title with humility. "I only did what anyone would do," she said, standing before the cameras and flashing microphones. "I listened when Bear told me something was wrong. I spoke up because silence would have meant more suffering for people like June and Gerald. I hope our story will inspire others to look closer, to question what's hidden behind closed doors, and never underestimate the power of a single act of courage, whether it has 2 legs or 4. There were no villains in the garden that day, only people striving to heal, some from wounds visible, others from scars that would never show. The mayor spoke, vowing new reforms. Caleb and Maddox stood at the edge of the crowd, grinning and clapping. June led a prayer for those who hadn't survived, their names spoken aloud, the silence that followed thick with love and memory. After the crowd dispersed, Samantha found herself sitting on a weathered bench beneath a blooming magnolia tree. Bear sat at her feet, his head resting on her knee, watching butterflies dance among the petals. She leaned back, letting the sun warm her face, letting herself feel, for the first time, the true weight of hope. The journey wasn't over. There would be more hearings, more interviews, more days when the past returned in dreams or in the frightened eyes of new survivors. But for Samantha, there was comfort in knowing she was not alone. Gerald had started attending support groups. June was volunteering with advocacy organizations. And Bear was finally allowed to rest, spending his days in gentle retirement, doted on by everyone he'd helped. As the light faded and the garden grew quiet, Samantha stood and called out a farewell to the last stragglers. She let her gaze sweep over the beds of roses and wildflowers, the patches of sun and shadow, and knew this place was no longer just a memory of suffering. It was proof that even in the darkest places, hope could take root. Walking home with Bear, Samantha reflected on everything they'd learned. Healing, she realized, was a slow, imperfect process, a series of small steps, setbacks, and sudden moments of grace. It began with truth, was built by courage, and blossomed in community. She promised herself that she would keep fighting for the vulnerable, would keep questioning, would never let her voice fall silent again. And Bear, trotting loyally beside her, became more than just a therapy dog. He was a living reminder that loyalty, instinct, and quiet courage could change the world. His story spread far and wide, inspiring other whistleblowers, animal lovers, and ordinary people to take action when something felt wrong. At home that evening, as Samantha poured Bear's dinner and watched him settle in his favorite spot by the window, she smiled. The world was far from perfect, but together they'd proven it could be made better. In the fading light, Samantha wrote her own letter, signing it with gratitude, love, and a final lesson. Sometimes, the most vulnerable among us, elderly, forgotten, animals, are the true catalysts for change. Never underestimate the ripple effect of a single act of courage. And as the stars blinked to life outside, Bear rested at her feet, the world at peace, hope blooming at last where there had once been only fear.